Of course I want to allow. Okay. So, hello, I'm Sheng. I want to talk about enterprise integration with Ruby. So, a little bit about myself. I work for IDA, Infocom Development Authority, although we are going to change name soon. I'm sure you have heard from the news. But instead of working at the IDA HQ, I'm deployed to Ministry of Manpower to develop e-services, mainly Ruby on Rails. And we are hiring. So if you are good engineers, you would like to work on government e-services, come talk to me later. All right. Of course, opinions are all mine. So the motivation for this talk is a lot of us, why we got into Ruby programming is because programming Ruby and Rails is very fun. But until you realize that you have to start integrating with other systems. So especially in an enterprise environment, or let's say if you develop a system for your client, you might encounter some problems when you try to integrate with their existing systems. So some of the background, like I said, it's very common to have requirements to integrate with other systems, especially enterprises. They are invested in some proprietary or so-called COTS products, commercial off-the-shelf products, for example, some CRM tool, ERP tool, whatnot. And in terms of bespoke enterprise software development, thank you. Test. Okay. In terms of bespoke enterprise software development, you will find that Java and .NET is still the mainstream. But in my humble opinion, at least based on my experience, I think Ruby is catching up. Despite the fact that vendor support is still limited as of today. So if you look at the typical big software houses, they still don't do much in Ruby, which is fine. Of course, this talk is not about government, just to set expectation. I won't go into, despite the fact that I'm going to talk about enterprise integration, I won't be talking about architecture patterns, although there's a lot of growing interest in topics like SOA and microservices. For the Star Trek fans out there, this is not the Starship Enterprise. First thing, database. A lot of us use what? Postgres, MySQL, SQLite, of course, for development environment. In enterprise, you will find that Oracle is still the most popular one. You have to integrate with Oracle. For that, you have to, luckily there's Ruby gems for that, of course. Ruby OCI 8, if you want to query Oracle database. And if you use Active Record, especially when you use Rails, you can use this Active Record Oracle Enhanced Adapter, straightforward. But sometimes they may not be just one database. They may be multiple database servers. So how do you connect to different database server? Also very straightforward. In database YAML file, you just add another database setting, and then specify the host port, database, user and password that you want. And then in your Active Record model, you just have to specify this code to establish connection explicitly to the target database server that you want. Level 3, how to secure database access from application. So I'm not a security expert, but I guess as a rule of thumb, we try to use database user with just enough power for applications. So you can actually just create a user, database user, and then you grant only select, insert, update permission to that user, and then use that in your database YAML. This is so that, let's say if one day your application has a SQL injection vulnerability, and that has been discovered by hacker, and by having this limited access, you can actually avoid being attacked, like for example, dropping your database schema, dropping your database tables and whatnot. Then you may ask, how about deleting records? Because we are doing CRUD, right? Create, read, update, delete. How do we delete records? So instead of deleting the record from the database table physically, you can actually mark the record as deleted or soft delete. You can actually use a gem called Paranoia. What it does is that you have to add a new column called deleted add to your database table. And when you delete it, you actually update that column to the current date time. And when that column is not now, it will be deemed as deleted. But what about running some rig tasks, for example, schema migration? because we have to run schema migration to create table to auto table, right? So what you can do is that you can actually enhance your rig task in such a way that right before you run schema migration, you switch to the more powerful user, which is essentially the same technique as I introduced just now. So you especially establish a connection with a user with a higher privilege. Database, boring stuff. Move on to authentication. So authentication, very easy. Device, database authentication. Boring. In enterprise, you will very likely to find this thing called Active Directory. Active Directory is actually Microsoft implementation of directory service. So what it does is that in that Active Directory, there's a sysadmin that actually maintains the list of users, groups, computers, services, and whatnot. And every time your enterprise user logins to the machine will actually authenticate against the Active Directory. There are a few protocols or ways for your Ruby or Rails application to authenticate against Active Directory. Two protocols that I have tried before are LDAP and Kerberos. So how to do LDAP in Ruby? LDAP is actually quite straightforward, yeah. Basically, you bind to the LDAP server, and then you can specify the parameter that you want, the username and whatnot. It's actually standard library. It's not really a Ruby gem, but it's part of a standard library called NetLDAP, which you can do a LDAP connection. But if you use device, of course, there's a device extension called Device LDAP Authenticatable. As for Kerberos, you can use this TeamFile KRB5auth gem. And if you use device, there's also a device extension for it. There are actually a few GitHub repository for the same gem, as in different forks. I actually like this particular fork because this is the only fork that comes with unit tests. So if you want to do continuous update, you need to have specs, right? Yeah, so yeah, specs. So choose your gem wisely, especially when it's open source.
Acceptance tests help.
Okay. Well, when you want to do testing, right, especially integration tests, you want to have Active Directory running on every development machine, but you may not have the money, or you may not want to spend the money on buying the licenses. So one thing you can do is there's actually a gem called Ladder. It's an alternative to Active Directory, which implements LDAP and Kerberos. What it does is that it allows you to spin up a embedded directory server in Ruby. So you can write Ruby code to spin up server. And under the hood, it actually uses Apache DS, which is a Java embedded directory server. So after authentication, people talk about single sign-on. Why? Because there are too many applications in an enterprise environment. So people are lazy. People just want to log in once and to be able to access different applications and services. So level 1, OAuth. I hope this is, I hope Ruby programmers are, I hope you guys are quite familiar with this, especially when you try to integrate with Facebook, Twitter. I think they are all using OAuth. So it works by delegating user authentication to service that hosts user accounts. So if you are using Facebook Connect or log in with Facebook, you actually delegate the user authentication to Facebook. And then that API just authorizes the party application, which is your application, to access user account. So you can access the user's data, whether it's Facebook or Twitter. There are actually a few different so-called grunt types, different flows. For server-side application, authorization code flow is the most common one. So there's a few entities. There's user agent, auth server, and application. So let's say if you are authenticating against Facebook, this is the auth server, and then your application will be the client application. You can read more about this at this link at the bottom there, DigitalOcean. It's a pretty good tutorial. So how about implementing OAuth to a provider? Let's say you want to actually set up a Rails app that provide the OAuth SSO service rather than consuming it. There's a gem for that called Doorkeeper, and you can easily use it with device. As for consuming, I guess you just use OAuth too. But if you use device, actually there are a few other extensions depending on what kind of OAuth service that you are consuming. Of course, to be very honest, in enterprise, at least based on my experience, by and large, OAuth is quite rare. So what I have encountered very often is actually this protocol called SAML, which is XML based. And of course, there are different kind of flows, once again, different kind of protocols, different kind of bindings. This is the one that I've seen more commonly used. So there's this, okay, browser is actually the user. If I can use the clicker, the pointer. Okay, this is the browser. And then you have a service provider, which is your application. Identity provider, which is the central identification server. So this is roughly the flow.
Yep.
Okay. There's a gem for that, once again, called libsaml. You can use that for implementing service provider as well as identity provider. Next up, Web Services API. Level 1, REST API, very common. Especially when you do Rails application, you tend to expose your Rails application as a REST API so that your mobile application or your front-end JavaScript application, let's say if you are using a thick client JavaScript MVC framework like React or AngularJS, then you want to consume it by using via REST API. But in enterprise, once again, REST is not as common as this protocol called SOAP. Yeah. Like I said, for some reason, enterprise ID still loves SOAP more than REST. But more and more enterprise applications are embracing REST. So I'm seeing more and more products actually providing REST API. So hopefully in the future, when it comes to integration, it'll be a lot easier. But then again, how to do SOAP in web services? It turns out that it's actually not that difficult. If you want to implement a SOAP provider, you can use this gem called washout. And if you want to consume SOAP services, you can use this gem called saveon, which has quite comprehensive documentation. I definitely recommend these two gems if you're implementing SOAP. As for web service security, security is a very, very tough topic. To be honest, I'm not an expert, but just to share a bit of my experience. Level 1, you can do basic authentication using username and password. So when you send your SOAP message, you can actually hardcode your username and password. Of course, the security guy will come in and say, oh, no, this is not secure enough. So someone will say, oh, you have to implement certificate-based authentication. So how does it work? So basically, consumer, I have to go and buy SSL certificate from certificate authority. And then I have to put a certificate somewhere in the server. And when I construct my SOAP message, I have to generate a so-called digest value by computing the hash value from my SOAP message body. And after that, I have to sign the digest value with my private key to create a signature value. And then later on, I have to encode my public key certificate, my message digest, and the signature into the SOAP message, and then send it over to the provider. And then the provider, what it does is that it will actually try to compute the message digest from the message body using the hashing algorithm that I specify in my message. And then at the same time, it will try to decrypt the signature value using my certificate, which is encoded in the SOAP message, to create message digest number 2. And then lastly, it has to compare these two messages to a certain whether they are the same or not. If they are not the same, then it's very likely that the message has been tampered. So this is the high-level flow. Fortunately, most of these signing verification steps have been taken care by this gem called Akami. I hope I pronounce it correctly. I call it Akami, which is also used by saveon. Then it may not be secure enough. Then someone will say, okay, no, you have to implement so-called mutual SSL authentication. This is actually at the transport layer. So what it does is that both client and the server, the consumer and the provider, have to import each other's SSL certificate into their trusted key store, such that when client establish a connection to the server, both ends will actually try to verify each other's certificate to ensure that the connection actually comes from a genuine remote host. Printer. Sometimes we have to print something from Rails application. We have to batch print, for example, letters. So luckily there is also a gem for that. You can use CUPS, which is actually a Ruby bridge to this CUPS API. CUPS stands for Common Unix Print System, if I'm not mistaken. It's a Unix common utility. Unfortunately, this CUPS gem has some outstanding issues. So we encountered some segmentation fault, which is still unresolved. It still remains on the GitHub open issues. That's why we have to resort to another approach, which is by shouting out to the LPR command. So LPR, then you specify your printer IP address and port, and then the printer name. The nice thing about it is that you can actually specify what option you want. I want to print in A4 size, and it has to be two-sided long edge. So it's pretty neat as well. Of course, there are more. There are a lot of things like messaging queues, enterprise service bus, FTP, log aggregation monitoring, payment gateway, continuous integration delivery, and of course, continuous update, which I will not be able to cover. But another thing about testing, we've been talking about specs and integration testing. So in unit tests, right, in specs, you can actually try to mock out the external call. So you wouldn't want your unit test to hit the external services directly. And very often in development environment, you will not even have access to the external services. So how do you do that? You can actually use webmock and also VCR. So VCR is like you will actually record your response once, and then when you run the test, right, you will keep replaying the same response. So you will not be hitting the external services. Another more straightforward way is you can actually set up some dummy Rails or Sinatra application. They try to emulate the endpoints that you're hitting. For that, you may want to set up a Vagrant Box or Docker container so that it's easier for other developers to spin up the same applications and environment. One of our projects actually uses this tool called Multibank, which allows us to actually specify what are the services that we want to mock out, what are the response that we expect, and what are the requests that we expect, and what are the responses they want to return in a JSON file. If you are interested, you can find out more from this link. So finally, enterprise integration with Ruby may sound daunting and boring at times. But after all, it's not impossible. And in fact, it's actually quite interesting because you may actually try to find out why do people want to make things so difficult for developers. Because like different people has different security. Precisely. People have different perspective, different level of risk appetite. All right. Especially in enterprise, people are kiasu, afraid of failing, afraid of risk, whatnot. Yeah. So, any question?
So IDEA is moving to Ruby. What you say just now is mostly done in Java world.
Yeah, correct. A lot of the practices that I show are actually quite common in Java. So if you come from the Java background, you have done Java enterprise software development for years, I think this should be quite common to you guys. As for the direction towards Ruby, I can't really say that, but
yeah, I don't know the motivation of Ruby. I mean, all the enterprises using Java doing exactly what you say just now.
Right.
Yeah. And what is the motivation to go to Ruby?
One motivation?
Okay, so
Java 8 update 77 shipped this morning.
Okay, so I just want to give my perspective. I'm not speaking on behalf of IDEA because, I mean, people who come with direction are usually working at the HQ. I'm actually deployed to the site as I mentioned. So it just happens that the project that I'm involved in uses Ruby. Yeah, that's why I had to do it in Ruby. But of course, there are benefits of using Ruby because, for example, let's say if you want to develop application fast, right? You want to change things fast. it will be easier and faster to build things in Ruby. Okay, of course, it also depends on the team size, your developers. So if it happens that your team developers prefer Ruby and are more well-versed in Ruby, then of course Ruby is probably a better choice. But let's say if you're working with a team of Java experts who are very well-versed in Java and who can code Java as fast as another Ruby programmer coding in Ruby, then perhaps you can go with Java, right? But to us, especially in the project that I'm involved, I guess we are trying out new things. It's not only Ruby, but also things like, for example, agile development, trying out practices like test-driven development, continuous integration, continuous delivery. Yeah, so that's the motivation.
Your Ruby work that you're working alongside Java folks with, do you use JRuby, do you use MRI, or do you use a mix of the two? Because I would think that in that kind of an environment, JRuby would be all kinds of win for you guys.
For the main application, we don't use JRuby, but for some parts of the, like there are some systems that actually run on JRuby. Yeah, for the main application that we are developing, we don't use JRuby. Yeah.
Okay, so we're running a bit short on time, so if you have any more questions, you can talk to Sheng after the meetup, or you can ping him on his Twitter account. Okay, so next we have Bruce. So